Greetings, this is Cody, and you're listening to Cantus Firmus at the Movies, where we are discussing the 2009 film Mr. Nobody. My guest is Steve Hilliker, an atheist ex-Christian who lives near Seattle with his wife and two teenage sons. Steve deconverted from Christianity in 2005 while earning his bachelor's degree in biblical studies and was planning to be a pastor. What followed was a major life crisis. Steve's career path was gone, and his wife was still a Christian. He worried about how they would raise their kids. He couldn't find resources or a community for ex-Christians, and he struggled with depression. Years later, Steve realized the importance for himself and others in discussing these experiences. In 2017, Steve started the Voices of Deconversion podcast to encourage ex-Christian atheists and agnostics. And thank you, Steve, for being here.
Yeah, thanks, Cody. I appreciate you having me on. I'm excited to get into this.
Yeah, me too. The movie you picked was an interesting one that I had never seen before. It may actually be the first Jared Leto film that I've seen all the way through. He's one of those kind of icons,
weird,
that you sort of hear about. But yeah, so I wanted to get a little bit more into your background. So the podcast you have, the Voices of Deconversion, is interesting. For me as someone who's interested in subjects of faith and non-faith, and it's kind of, even if you're not an atheist or you haven't made a deconversion, it's sociologically interesting, and it's also interesting to sort of be able to empathize with someone else's experience. So I found it to be a valuable exercise for myself. But you were working on a bachelor's degree at the time. Did you complete that?
Yeah. I ended up with my bachelor's degree in biblical studies, but it was the end of my junior year when I was, I think, in a bit of denial. Like I like to kind of compare going through deconversion. A lot of times has a lot of those 5 stages of grief in it, because a lot of us don't want to deconvert. It just happens. And I was in the denial phase until my wife turned to me one day when I was talking about the humanity of Jesus and maybe he's not divine. And I wasn't thinking about the consequences of my words. Yeah. And then she was Christian. This was really upsetting to her. And she just goes, "You're not a Christian anymore." And I just turned around and looked at her like, what are you talking about? It was a complete shock. So it was, at that moment, it was like, oh, she's right. And so then it was tough. So I was just finishing my junior year. So it was like, oh crap, now we got one more year to go. And what am I going to do? What are we going to do?
Sure. Wow. And what was the school you were going to?
Well, it was called Trinity Lutheran College, and it actually went out of business a couple years ago. Oh, wow. You can still find it online because they have like I want to say charity, but it's like a foundation or something that they created. And so, but anyway, it was based in the Lutheran, like, what do they call it? ELCA. It's kind of a liberal branch of the Lutheran Church. Gotcha. And I had no idea. I was a conservative Christian when I went there, and I didn't understand any of that. Yeah, sure. I was going to a Christian college. Yeah. So that was interesting to learn.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, it's too bad it was an Episcopalian school, because you could have been an atheist and still probably been a bishop or something.
And I thought about, you've invested all this time, and it's like, well, if I don't believe in God, like, could I just kind of fake it, and, in a serious way, not like, but yeah, you just, you're like, what are you going to do?
Oh, it's tough. Yeah. I don't feel that I'm in any major danger of a crisis of faith at the moment, but that is something I've thought about, because I'm working on a master's degree, and I've sort of thought, if I ever had some kind of a deconversion experience, would I regret of having gone through that education? Because it sort of seems like it's religion's kind of like the Force. You either choose the light side or the dark side. So you go to school and you study it, and you either end up teaching it and professing it, or you sort of take sometimes a more hostile view, it seems, in academia toward it.
Yeah. And I definitely had those thoughts of like, you have those regrets. And I think this is part of why I like this film, but you have those regrets. Like, why did I commit my life to this? Why was I so devoted to God? And I know it might be weird for your Christian listeners to hear, but why was I so devoted to God and all in like that, to have it all go away? And now all my career path's gone, my marriage is in jeopardy. So yeah, you definitely have those why did I pursue that type of thoughts?
Sure. What was your own personal was it kind of more of an experiential or existential sort of crisis, or was it related to, was it intellectual more, or how did that go about for you?
Yeah, that's funny because a lot of my guests on my podcast, it's really, I think it varies, but for me, I'll just say for me, it was kind of academic and kind of it was an intellectual thing. Mm-hmm. I do think there's definitely emotions in there. We're human, and so I can't just say like it was strictly academic, but for me, that's when it started to kind of fall apart, was when I started learning some different understandings of the Bible, these liberal ideas of like the Bible as a metaphor, things like that. And then starting to go, oh, wow, I can be a Christian and not have to believe like a snake talked to a person or a donkey talked to a person or something, like I can just set those things aside. So yeah, it was kind of discovering all those things that started me down this path of like, okay, the Bible's not exactly the inerrant word of God, which is what I thought it was when I was growing up,
Sure.
So that's what kind of started it all.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if there's a clean transition from that to the film, but I was just interested in some of the background that you had there.
Yeah.
Well, so for those who haven't seen the film, and this is the kind of film that I don't think you can discuss without spoiling, so we're just going to go ahead and spoil it. The film Mr. Nobody was made in 2009, starring Jared Leto. And the director's name, I've struggled with pronunciation a little bit. He appears to be a French-Belgian, and I think it's Jacques Van Dormeel, maybe, something to that extent. And basically the idea of the film, and I'll just sort of borrow the tagline that was used on the website when they were promoting the film, and that is, a boy stands on a station platform as a train is about to leave. Should he go with his mother or stay with his father? Infinite possibilities arise from this decision. As long as he doesn't choose, anything is possible. And that's actually a pretty succinct explanation. But the basic idea is that you have this character who you see when he's much older, as the film starts, and it starts to unwind all these possibilities. And you find out as the film goes on that it all goes back to this moment where he's forced to make a choice between his two parents who are divorcing. And but then there's, of course, other choices that happen along the way. And they tend to center around who he ends up with romantically. So there's three women in particular. There is Elise, who's this girl he meets in high school, who's this sort of troubled, this is if he stays with his dad, this sort of troubled girl, and she's in love with someone else, and they get married, and she's depressed, and stays in her room the whole time. And then as the film goes on, you find that she's still in love with this other person who, I guess he'd hoped that she'd forgotten about after they'd started dating in high school. Then there's the Anna character, who is sort of becomes a stepsister if he stays with his mom, and they take up a sort of romantic relationship. And then there's a third woman who I don't feel like you get as much of, and maybe that's reflective of how he feels about her, because it's this life where he's wealthy and he goes after all these things that are supposed to make him happy, but he's not. He's depressed and he's contemplating suicide, and she seems perfectly wonderful, but for whatever reason, he's just not into it. And you see her a lot less. You don't really know much about her. And like I said, maybe that's a way of, seeing her through his eyes, that there's not much there to see.
Yeah.
But I feel bad for her a little bit. He's an older man in the future looking back at all these choices. They introduced this sort of sci-fi futuristic world that I don't know if that ever fully pays off, but he seems to be the last person who's mortal. Everyone else can choose to extend their lives permanently. And that may fit in a way that I haven't quite figured out yet. But I kind of remember watching the film and sort of thinking, okay, was that there just to look cool, or was that part of the plot somehow that was important? But he's looking back at all these choices, and it's about, the significance of choices and what you're supposed to, how you're supposed to feel about the choices you make, and that kind of thing. The significance of the choices that you make in life. And I'd be curious, you kind of alluded to this earlier about why this film might stand out for you as an important one. Why was this one that you wanted to discuss when I got in touch with you?
Yeah. I think the thing that I like the most about the film is that scene near the end of the movie where the guy's asking them, you've told me these three different stories, they can't all be correct. They're all contradictory. And then the old man says, do you mean to say that we need to make choices? We have to make choices. And the guy asks him something else, and he asks, which one's the right one? Which life's the right one? And the old man says, every life is the right one. Each of these paths is the right path. And that's actually why I like the film, because for me, with my kind of my history, I had not only had I chosen a path that I thought was firm and solid, there were other things in my life, other times earlier when I kind of had an idea of what I wanted out of my life and it didn't work out. And so you look back and sometimes you have these regrets, and you think like, well, what would have happened if I had, had different hobbies or had different interests or gone a different direction. Mm-hmm. And so it's all these what ifs, and this film actually helped me kind of come to peace with the idea of like, it's okay, whatever happened. Like in this film, you can see these three different scenarios. In two of them, he's not really, let's see. No, in one of the options, he's not really into his wife that much, but she's into him. And then the other two, he's really into his wife. Like, he's in love with her, but like the one's mentally ill, not really in love with him. And then the other one is in love with him, but then it ends up not being what they thought it would be in the end. So it's just, to me, what I like is that it's a way of saying like, no matter what path you take in life, there's going to be ups and downs. There's going to be good and bad. And I think the takeaway for me is like, just live life, just embrace it, all the crazy twists and turns that it brings. So that's kind of the takeaway message that I got from it. And it's kind of comforting in a way, that thought, I think. But
yeah, that's interesting. Well, the every path is the right path thing was an interesting idea for me, because it seems to me that you could take that to an extreme, and I think most of us would probably disagree with it, right? So like, so like on the one hand, I definitely agree that we far too often will look back at the tough choices we made, and like which job to take, which person to marry, and these are choices that don't necessarily have like moral content. They're each one would be fine to make, but we agonize over whether it was the right choice, and this kind of anxiety, I think, can like paralyze us in the present, and so that we can't really live in the moment. We don't really invest where we are now with as much value and significance as we should. And I see this happening in the film, for example, with Nemo and the one wife, Jean, who he's just not interested in. And then there's Elise, who is the wife that's not interested in him. And she does that with him. I mean, she's reflecting on this other person, this other choice, this other path that she could have made. And meanwhile, she has a perfectly wonderful husband who's doing everything he can for her. And they have kids together, and he's a great dad. Right. But she can't stop thinking about this idiot.
Stefano.
Yeah, even his name, you go, okay, what an idiot.
Yeah, come on. Yeah.
But yeah, so that I think is totally valid. That at some point we have to say, this is where we are, whether through our own choices or through, chance or fate or whatever. And let's make the most that we can out of it. Let's, bloom where we're planted or whatever. We find value where we are, and we make it work.
Yeah.
So, but on the other hand, like, we wouldn't like look very fondly on a serial killer reflecting on his past choices and deciding that the path he chose was the right path just because he happened to choose it.
Right.
So I think if you remove the moral equation, because like I said, I may be.
Is it hard for you to kind of not have those mixed together?
Yeah.
And yeah.
Well, I think it's this sort of complicated thing of, I'm interested in philosophy and logic. And so sometimes people make statements that, semantically are very broad. Like any choice you make is the right choice. And you go, well, wait a second, that can't be true. But they mean something else by it. And so
yeah. And I think that's true of this film. And I mean, that's how I would kind of perceive. I mean, I would agree, like, obviously someone looking back and saying like, should I have murdered 30 women or should I have murdered 25? Like, which one was the right one? Like that's obviously ridiculous, but
sure. But yes. So if you take away that, yes, if you limit the scope to what I think the film is trying to focus on, then I think it is a perfectly valid observation.
Well, and something that, and it isn't about morality for me as far as what I get out of it, but something that is key, to all of this is when I was a conservative Christian, I believed that God had a plan for me, like he has for everyone, God's will. He has a specific plan. There's verses in the Bible about God having a plan for you and things like that. And in the conservative church or the more evangelical church, I think that's more prominent. And so you spend, although it's prominent throughout Christianity, but you spend a lot of your time thinking like, what's God want for my life? What path should I take? Is it the right one? Is it the one God wants me on? And so it was ingrained in my head from a young age that like I'm supposed to live a certain life, a certain way. I just have to find out what that is from God. And so, when things fall apart and you're like, well, like that wasn't supposed to happen, then it's kind of comforting to look back and go, no, it's okay. Like shit was going to happen. Oh, sorry.
That's okay.
I don't know. Can I swear?
That's fine. That's fine.
Okay. Yeah. So like stuff was going to happen anyway. You know what I mean? Like either way, no matter what happened. So.
Yeah, no, I'm definitely familiar with that concept. And that seems to me like maybe a kind of a folk Christianity, or not even a folk Christianity, but because I mean, you sort of have this concept outside of the church, like soulmates and star-crossed lovers, those kinds of things that really go back to this notion of fate.
Yeah,
and I think maybe imported it a little bit. I mean, so I think that God says, "I know the plans that I have for you," is I believe a passage about Israel and them coming back to, after
right.
coming back after the exile.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but at the same time, I mean, I think that Scripture is a little like the biblical perspective is a little more robust. But certainly this idea that everything that happens, God is. Well, I suppose you would find that in some Lutheran and some Calvinist denominations and traditions where God has what they call meticulous sovereignty or meticulous determinism, that everything that comes to pass is God's will. So even the things that seem terrible are somehow within God's purposes.
Yeah, and I wasn't Calvinist, but I actually didn't really associate with that at all growing up, the idea of like, predestination and like everything's mapped out for you. But I grew up in the Covenant Church, which is a conservative evangelical church. And I guess I would say it's similar to Baptist, but then I also had exposure to charismatic Christianity. So a lot of like speaking in tongues and things like that. So it was kind of a mix, but yeah, that idea, I mean, even at the, liberal Christian school I went to, there was definitely, I actually gave a speech about it in one of my classes when I was kind of deconstructing that idea as a Christian, that, it's okay, whatever path you take, like God's gonna, it's fine with God either way. It's kind of the thing, like as long as you you're moral, you're good, you do the right thing, he's your savior, then the rest is kind of not as important. And that was kind of I was kind of starting to have those beliefs when I was going through school. And there were definitely people who did not receive that well. Like people want to feel like, that God sees them as special and that he has a plan and he cares for them. So if you say he doesn't have a plan for you, it's like, what? Are you saying God doesn't love me? So it doesn't, doesn't
No, I know what you mean. Yeah.
I mean, all through the Bible, I feel like there's always kind of a plan. And
I think, you're absolutely correct. I think there's sort of an end goal in mind. The passage that I think people quote a lot is in Romans 8, where Paul says that everything works together for the good to those, basically for those who are who are loved by God, for the Christians specifically. So everything works together for the good, and so I think Paul is sort of taking into account things that happen that are bad, things that happen that are good, but then ultimately you get this end goal is something that's good. As for
kind of more along the lines of how you see it, or
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I certainly wouldn't want to take like a deistic view that God is completely uninvolved, but I think you do have to take into account human choices because they're there. I don't think that everything that human beings do are things that God meticulously foreordained. But I do think that, the biblical perspective, I think, seems to take into account human choices and God's interaction. And so, but I think some people use the language of God as like a chess player or something like that, a master chess player who is going to win the game regardless of what happens. But that doesn't mean that if your child is hit by a car that, okay, well, that must have been something God wanted to do for some reason or another.
Right.
God put that car there and my kid there, and that was something he foreordained from the beginning of the universe. I wouldn't take that kind of perspective.
Yeah. No, I think that would be. I don't know any Christians that do actually. In my experience,
but maybe we should move away from that specific question. But I do think So removing the idea of the morality of it, I was thinking about like wisdom. So even if every choice might not be, morally wrong or something like that, couldn't you look back and sort of say, okay, well, this may have been the wrong choice because I didn't really think through what I was doing. I didn't take into account all the information that I should have. And so, I ended up married to someone who's like an alcoholic or an abuser or whatever. And if I would have listened to the people around me who cared, then, you know what I mean? So sometimes you have those things, right? Where their wisdom and still has to factor in, I think, when you're talking about choices that you make.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, because I don't think it would be a good idea to take away from the movie that every choice that you make, like what you just said, basically, like you should be able to look back on life and say, like, yeah, I did this wrong or that right, and learn from it and move on. So that does kind of contradict kind of what I get from the film. And I think that's okay, and that's good. I think to kind of have those things in tension where, I can look back and say, I should never have made that choice that I made. But then also be able to look back and say, you know what, it happened. Like,
yeah, sure.
Now what do I focus on? Like you said, live in the present and focus on kind of the future. But that's a good point. Learning from it,
where do you go from here is still a live question, instead of staying stuck in that past moment. But yeah, I kind of feel like as I watched the film and his choice to be with Elise, who's the girl who's in love with someone else, I don't think was the right choice to make.
Yeah.
Would you look at that choice and feel like, okay, well, that was just as good a choice as any of the other ones we could have made?
No, I agree with you. It wasn't the right choice. And I find that ironic because the whole point of the film is like every choice is the right choice. I mean, so I do think there's it's this tension that's kind of like there that, I agree. Like his right choice was Anna. I mean, I feel like Anna was the right one. They were meant for each other. It seemed like they both loved each other equally, at least for a time.
Maybe. Yeah. I would actually, it's tough to say because they never show you Jean, but Jean actually seemed like maybe the best choice to me because she seemed like she loved him in a more uncomplicated and straightforward way, but he was unable to reciprocate.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, what did you say?
Oh, that's good. But he was just unable to reciprocate that. But it seemed like if you were to look at all three of those women, I mean, Anna, they obviously have a lot of, attraction or whatever. But I think right at the key moment, she sort of pulls out, and it's, it was probably it obviously seemed to be a very complicated and messy relationship for them to undertake as teenagers living in the same house together. So I would almost be tempted to say that Jean might have been the right choice.
Well, I think I'd probably distinguish between like who was the best woman, and then like who was he meant to be with. I feel like at the end, he sees Anna when he's on the park bench and they embrace, and it's like this, it worked out in the end kind of feeling. And I feel like I could be wrong, but she seems the most prominent throughout the film. Like you see a lot more of their relationship. But as far as like the best person, Jean seems to, she's head over heels for him. Like even when they meet at the dance floor, like she's putting her head on his shoulder and saying his name, and she's obviously like in love from the start. And that seems to be true when they're older and they have their house and they're established and stuff. And so I think she definitely was the most in love with him of the three women.
Well, and Anna is his last word. And it seems that like, as he is sort of reflecting back or whatever, that's the path that he wanted to have taken, that he sort of is choosing maybe. And it kind of feels like the movie is saying, okay, I know that we said every path is the right path, but really Anna was the right path.
That's so funny. Yeah. What's interesting, I made all my notes. I watched the movie, and then I watched a review on YouTube about it, and something I didn't pick up on, well, I sort of picked up on, was that, and this ties in a little bit of that futuristic kind of sci-fi stuff that you were talking about earlier, is that up until the point, and this may not be perfect, but up until the point that the boy has to make that decision at the train station, everything from that point forward are all of the possibilities, all of the things that could happen. And so in the end, when the whole, like, the futuristic universe starts coming apart, it's him going away from that choice, that path. He's like, he runs at the very end, he doesn't choose his mom or his dad. He runs down another path. And so it's him dismantling that option in his mind, or that choice in his mind, is kind of how I took that.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. Well, some of the specific details, I struggled a little bit to follow how it all was fitting in.
Yes.
I think specifically, so because there are these sort of sub choices that appear at different points. So it seems like when he chooses to be with Elise, there's one option where Elise is there and he could react this way, but instead he chooses Jean. Right? Am I wrong about that? Because he sees Elise at the dance.
At the dance floor. Yeah, because he says the first woman I dance with is going to be the woman that I marry.
Exactly. So he could have picked Elise there. So there's one where he picks Elise, one where he goes this other direction, and so that's like after he's already made this choice about who he's going to stay with and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But there's this one, in one of these scenarios, he ends up going off the road and crashing, and I think that's the one where he's with Anna. Right? Is that the only one where he's with Anna? Does he end up dying young with Anna either way?
I thought he died on the motorcycle because it was Elise had rejected him. She was with Stefano.
There's a car wreck too where he falls into the lake. He drives into the lake.
Yeah, that's when he's with Anna and he's like, I love you more, and they're going back and forth. They're clearly deeply in love. Life's great as far as the relationship goes, and then a bird hits the window and it's all over from there. So
is that the only scenario where he's with Anna, or is there another one where they live older? They live together.
I think there's the one where they separate. Like, she goes with her dad, and then she makes a pact to herself that she's never going to love anyone until they meet again. And essentially their lives diverge, and they don't meet again until they're adults. I saw that as a different one than.
Different one. I sort of took it as at the end of the movie, they end up together. She finds him on the park bench or whatever, and then they probably get married, and then he gets in the wreck. That was kind of how I understood that, but maybe I'm wrong about that.
Well, yeah, and it's so all over the place, the movie is, and I admit, like, there's moments when you're watching it, you're like, this is so weird.
Well, it's interesting to me to think that in the Anna one, he has a shorter life, but that's still maybe the one he wants to choose.
Well, and I just think that's so interesting to think back on, like, what would you choose? Like, if you think of your own life, like, would I choose a happier marriage, a fulfilling career, the perfect family, but I die young? Or would I prefer to live a long, full life, be super wealthy like he was in this one scenario, but not really love my spouse all that much and feel kind of bored with life because everything's kind of set out for him now? That's what he said. He's bored, he says he's bored. And so, yeah, I think those are interesting ideas to think about. Like, what makes life valuable as far as, like, the life on Earth here? Like, what's more important to us? Yeah.
Yeah, and that kind of brings to mind this whole sort of paralysis of choice thing. And I think it's something that Anna says, renouncing all possible lives for only one with you, or for one only with you. Yeah. And that really every choice we make requires us to exclude other choices. And that can be kind of scary, especially when you're not sure which one is the right one.
Yeah.
And even if there are multiple choices that are valid, you still have to pick one. And anything that you could get from the other choice only, you lose because you've chosen the first choice or whatever.
Yeah.
That sort of brings to mind, I think it specifically brings to mind for me, the choice to be married. Who you marry is one of those things that, if you're thinking about it the right way, this is, forsaking all others, as they say.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
I mean, I've heard that before, but yeah, no, that's in relation to this movie, that's a great way to put it, forsaking all others.
Yeah.
Because you could have these other options, but this is your choice to move forward with.
Yeah.
With this woman. Yeah.
Yeah. Which I think, there is that paralysis of choice because we're so afraid of what we might miss out on. It seems to me that if you're making a choice to marry somebody, you can't do it based on the feeling you're having at the moment, because you have to stop and soberly reflect on the fact that if you're doing this right, you are forsaking every other choice.
Yeah. And that can be troubling. And what's funny is, like, I tend to be really, I mean, I don't think it's a horrible thing, but it can be. I tend to be controlling. I tend to be really thorough in life. Whereas my wife is very, it's funny. It's always works out this way. She's laid back and kind of takes things as they come. So the message of the movie wasn't as profound for her because this is how she lives. Like, it's kind of like, okay, this happened. Well, what are we going to do about it? Kind of thing, where I'm more like, okay, this is what I want to be in life. I'm going to be a pastor and this is how it's going to work. And then when things get thrown up, it's like, oh my gosh, what do I do? So it's interesting what different people, different personalities can kind of see in the film, Yeah,
for sure. I spoke a little bit about the importance of wisdom and the choices that you make. And the film, I think fairly early on, maybe the first scene, there's this idea of pigeon superstition.
Yeah, I like that.
And so they have these pigeons that are placed in a box, and if they peck on this button or whatever, then the reward comes in through a little chute, and then they start putting it in every 20 seconds. So it doesn't matter what the pigeon does; it comes out at a certain time. But the pigeon will start to associate whatever he was doing at the time when the reward comes in with the cause of the reward.
Yeah,
and the point they seem to be making is that we often look at where we are now and think, okay, it's because we made the right choice back then.
Yeah.
And this may be one of those other thought experiments where I'm taking it too far, but it seems to me that there's a sort of suggesting that, okay, so yeah, obviously sometimes you make all the right choices and you still suffer, or you make all the wrong choices, but you still, live this wonderful life. But it seems to me like they're sort of saying that your choices, don't really matter because whatever is going to happen regardless. And it feels like in a way they're kind of, by doing so, it seems like that you're not really investing your choices with any value at all. Like it's kind of random. Just do whatever you feel like doing at the moment.
Yeah, I think that's the threat, or that would be the thing I think that would be taking it too far if you do just start to think like, my choices don't matter. I'm just going to live life, and like, I don't need to think things through. I don't need to plan. You know what I mean? Like that, I do think would be like too far. But I do think that people can, and maybe this is more like people like me, but credit yourself for things that go right and think like, I did this right, and that's why it worked out. And gosh, that was great. And I controlled everything and made sure everything happened the way I wanted it to, or everything went sideways, and I'm blaming myself and kicking myself for all of the stupid decisions I made. I think that there needs to be a balance between, like crediting and blaming yourself for things that happen, because like with the pigeon, like he didn't create that, the food coming through, but he thought he did. He thought his actions were causing these good things to happen. So I think it's like, in my personal view, it's a balance of chance and choice, and it's kind of this, try not to give too much weight to either, is the takeaway that I would get. Or that's what I'm going to decide to believe, like, whether the film wanted that or not. I think that's the chance and choice were, to me, like huge themes.
Oh, sure. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Do you feel like this pigeon thing is put in there haphazardly, or do you feel like there actually is a, because I'm trying to think of a place in the film where nobody falls prey to this sort of pigeon superstition issue, and I can't think of a place where he does.
That is a good observation, because I'm just going to look at my note really quick, because at the very end, I wrote about it, and I made a note about it. Okay, let's see here. Yeah. Well, it's kind of along the lines of what we were saying, like, stop giving yourself so much blame or credit for the results of your choices. That's pigeon superstition. But I don't think I can't think of a time that, I mean, maybe like when he was with Jean and he had planned out his life, like he said, there's, he rattles off 6 things when he's on that motorcycle with her that he's going to do. He's going to be rich. He's going to have a house. It's going to be yellow. He's going to, marry this woman. So in that sense, he takes credit for where he gets, but I don't know that that's really a big theme as far as that goes, I guess.
Again, maybe that was just for us as the audience, perhaps. But I was just trying to think if it actually kind of fit into what was happening in the film.
It has to, right? Because it was the first scene, but it's hard to kind of other than kind of how we're tying it in with not giving yourself too much credit or blame for things.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. Yeah.
Well, it occurs to me too. I mean, chance definitely plays a role here, but it occurs to me that we didn't really talk about the one choice where he shows up at an airport and a limousine driver is holding up a sign for a name that's not his, and he goes with the limousine driver. They take him to this nice hotel, and then he's shot by a mobster, point blank in the forehead. And I think, well, that probably was the wrong choice.
Yeah, yeah, it probably was. I do think, yeah. I think it's, I mean, kind of to your point, like, I don't think we can say like definitively that, choices never matter. You know, clearly that was a bad option for him. That was a bad path to take.
Yeah. Which, I mean, to some extent, he couldn't have predicted that was going to happen. So that's where that chance thing comes in. But I don't think it's entirely pigeon superstition to say that when you steal someone else's ride in their hotel room, that maybe it's not going to work out.
Yeah, that maybe those are just like consequences. Like, you're just dealing with consequences at that point, like of bad decisions.
Well, okay, so I'm interested in this because you talked about, and it may just be a turn of phrase, but the idea of Anna being meant for him. And as we're talking about choices, it occurs to me that, this issue of determinism or fate, it definitely weighs in. And, there are different Christian views about how this works out, as we were kind of hinting at before. But it seems to me that apart from maybe like followers of Ayn Rand, I can't think of any atheist philosophers who believe in free will. Some might believe in something like compatibilism, where they try to maintain it by sort of saying, well, you still make the choices you want to make, but you couldn't have made another choice. So they put it not in the making of the choice, but in the intention of the mind that's making it.
No, that's a good observation. When I saw your note about that, I thought that was a good thing to bring up. I just, in full disclosure, haven't studied a ton of atheist philosophers beyond just like here and there over the last 10, 15 years, but I do see the strain of materialism, the Richard Dawkins idea of like, we're just, we're physical, we're material, and, atoms are bouncing around in our brain. And actually, I think that's what you may have said in a podcast that I was listening to, but that it's all just kind of like, it's just natural things kind of bumping up against each other and like just happening. And so essentially we're not in control and everything is determined. And I mean, to me, like, I could see some truth in that. Like, that does make sense on some level. But I mean, at the end of the day, I just go, well, no, of course I have choices. Of course I have the ability to decide where I go and what I do and who I marry. And you know what I mean? Like maybe it's not consistent with most atheist philosophers or something, but at the end of the day, I feel like common sense just tells me, like, no, of course I have free will, Yeah.
No,
that's also the version of Christian I was, it's just funny,
Sure.
As a Christian, I believe that too. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think common sense dictates that we make choices. I think you could argue that might be an apologetic argument for Christianity or theism, at least. That if it is in fact the case that we make choices, and at the very least atheistic materialism doesn't allow for that, which is at least the argument that atheist philosophers generally make. Then that might require some form of theism.
Well, and I think maybe you can elaborate a little bit what you mean. But like, I think as far as atheist materialism goes, I see those as two different things. Like atheist, obviously tells you one thing about a person. There are probably, I'm guessing there are people out there who are not atheist materialists. I guess I'd say I'm not. But how does that make a case for theism then, in your view? Yeah.
So at this point, I don't think there are many atheists who aren't materialists. So at one point that was different. So you would have, for example, atheist idealists who would point to the primacy of mind as opposed to the primacy of matter. But at this stage of the game, atheism, I think, has sort of tended to hitch its wagon to materialism. I think just because it seems to be the only game in town. So an atheist in theory could say, well, I believe that there are souls, that this, immaterial part of human being or mind or spirit, or I believe in ghosts, or I believe in the existence of abstract objects like numbers or whatever. But there's just very few that do. And I think that, and that might be partly a historical accident. I mean, it's always possible, I think, that there could be this rise of Neoplatonism and all the atheists move that way again or something. But it seems to me that the way that atheists have tended to go about it is to say, well, we rely on our experience of the physical world. And so if we want to talk about things existing that are not physical, that are spiritual or supernatural, well, that's just something that we don't really, countenance.
Yeah, I think that's like the Sam Harris kind of take on things. Like even your thoughts are like chemical, physical reactions or physical processes that are happening, Yeah. And I mean, that's a really like fascinating, I guess, area to kind of like discover and learn about. It's interesting to me, but oftentimes these types of discussions can get, and I don't think you're this type of Christian, but can get derailed into like, I'm going to try to convince you God's real by like showing you that materialism isn't real. And then we'll kind of like, show you that, you really don't want to believe materialism, right? So let's go believe this over here. But I think as far as like the discussion goes, it's fascinating to think, okay, are we just determined? Is it just all determined? I mean, I've actually been thinking about that a little bit lately. Like, is it all just physical reactions in your brain and things that are happening and you really don't have any control over it and it was going to happen anyway? Or do you really have that choice? And that, if there is no God, that's a fascinating, and maybe even if there is, it's an interesting debate.
Yeah, it is. Well, and to clarify, so the podcast is, we're talking about films and reflecting on them from a philosophical or even a theological, if that's where you come in on it, viewpoint. But yeah, I'm not looking at this as an opportunity to bring an atheist onto my show to convert them in front of an audience.
And I didn't think, I didn't think so. You were pretty clear about that. Yeah. So I appreciate that. Yeah.
But I am interested in sort of seeing where these sort of issues are going to sort of touch on the film and where the relevance might be for us. So it's interesting to hear you sort of say that, maybe you're a little bit more agnostic on that subject.
Yeah. As far as materialism goes, I would say I'm agnostic. Cause I don't think I know enough about it to kind of say, definitively, this is what I believe.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. Something I was going to mention, and, we can come back to this if you have more thoughts on that and stuff. But something that was interesting to me, I just made a note about, was my son watched the movie with me. He's 17. And it was fascinating because I'm on kind of one side, I'm not the 118-year-old man. I'm not that far on that side, but I'm on one side of this choices dilemma. My son's on the other. So he is someone who is he was raised non-religious, and because we deconverted when he was little. But
and your wife ended up making that movement with you? Yeah,
she did, actually, a couple of years later for different reasons. So that was kind of fascinating. But my son was raised non-religious, but he's got this personality where he really struggles with like, what should I do in life? Like, he has like about 3 different career ideas for his life. And that's not uncommon for teenagers, but he's on this one side where he's like, what path should I take? And this like choice paralysis, and he just doesn't know, what to do. And then I'm on the other side looking back going, did I make the right choices? Was this the right path, or why did I take that path? And so it was kind of fun to kind of talk to him a little bit about like, that's his perspective. And it helps him in the sense that like, hey, just do your best and make the choices that you think are going to be the best for you, and go with it, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, it is interesting. Okay. So there's this distinction that linguists sometimes make between meaning and significance. And it's also one that you could bring into these areas of, philosophy or whatever.
Yeah.
And, so meaning is, so for example, in language, if I speak a sentence to you, my sentence has a meaning, and that meaning is what I meant for it to mean. So it's the sense that I've imbued it with when I say it. But what I say may spark something for you that wasn't in my mind when I constructed the sentence. And so that is the significance. And so there, I think as you watch this film, it's kind of vague on this idea of meaning. Does life actually have a meaning or a purpose or something like that? But there's a lot, maybe it leans more towards significance. And I think that's also the debate that sometimes atheists and Christians have about values. That something, maybe there's no objective moral value or whatever, but something or something still may have significance to me. It may be valuable to me.
Yeah, I think that's actually really interesting. It kind of, I have a couple different thoughts on it, but just with as far as the movie goes, like, I'm finding as I'm talking to you that maybe the movie's message wasn't 100% what I took away from it. You know what I mean? And I think for you as well, like there's probably things in the movie that it's saying that you're like, well, I see it sort of true, but I'm not totally on board with the full message, if that's the message of the movie. So yeah, there's the meaning of the movie, and then there's the significance that we kind of absorb and make for ourselves from it. And then as far as like the debate between Christians and atheists, or the discussion between Christians and atheists about life's meaning, that's a fascinating one for me, because I used to be the one on the other side saying like life should be objectively meaningful and needs to have objective meaning to have any kind of value in a sense. And I had a friend of mine who I went to school with, actually, who's an Episcopal priest now. And he was making this strong argument that like, like it has to be objective and stuff. And I was trying to kind of counter that with like, no, for it to be meaningful, it doesn't need to, it just subjective's okay. So that's definitely kind of an interesting idea too, or that discussion's a good one.
Yeah. Well, would you say that for Nemo though, is his primary concern about living a meaningful life or a significant life?
Okay, so is his primary focus to live the life that he's supposed to live, like intended to live, meaning?
Yeah.
Versus,
or does he have is it possible? I mean, does he have this thing in his head of what's the right decision? So that has to do with objectivity. But significance could be, well, whatever decision I make, I can still find value in it. Even if it, so there is no right or wrong decision, period, just because there's no right or wrong in some sort of, ultra mundane sense.
Yeah. I think when he's little, the decisions are meaningful. When he's older, I think he's finding significance in the decisions that are made. At least in that scenario, or in those scenarios that, I guess, I mean, I think that's a really complex question about kind of where Nemo's at, Mm-hmm. So when he's little, so maybe phrase that again, like when he's little and he's having to make the decision between mom or dad, how do you see meaning and significance playing in there?
Well, I think I'm thinking of it more as he's looking back when he's older, and there's this question of what was the right choice. And to say that, well, every path is the right path, I think is to say that any path that you can find value in is right, as opposed to sort of thinking, okay, what choice should I have made? To say that, well, I should have made this choice or that choice suggests that you're appealing to some sort of standard outside of your own, your innards or how you feel inside. And maybe the point of the film is about finding significance where you are, because there really isn't necessarily a right or wrong choice to make.
Or there's no value in second guessing the other choices you could have made at some point.
And that's the other factor. Is it trying to make a statement about how we come to terms with the choices we've made, or is it trying to make a statement about whether or not the choices we make are actually valuable?
I think it's coming to terms with the choices we've made. I think that's the point of it.
Yeah.
Because at the end, he says, after that speech about every path's the right path, he says, in chess, it's called zugzwang, when the only viable move is not to move. And to me, what he's saying there is there's no value in looking at second guessing your life. Learn to accept. To me, it's about acceptance of where you're at and learning to be okay with that. And then from there, that's kind of like a platform for you to kind of move forward in your life and move on, move on from these regrets or these second guessing moments that you're having.
Yeah. Most folks that I know who convert from Christianity to atheism have a tendency to get kind of into sort of scientific worldview kind of thing, and maybe that's your experience, or maybe it's not. But I was curious if you had any thoughts about the kind of use of pseudoscientific or cliched readings of scientific theories. So like string theory is invoked to allow for multiple universes based on individual human choices. The Big Crunch becomes this kind of plot device for reversing time. And the butterfly effect is invoked to sort of talk about the randomness of life. And I'm actually shocked that they left out Schrodinger's cat, because that seemed like the only like sort of, cliched, physics, theoretical physics kind of, idea that they left out of the film.
Yeah, so I think I did kind of, look into like some of these like scientific ideas or whatever, and kind of went that way when I first deconverted. Like, I started to look into evolution and geology and, sciences, because you're looking for, well, what can I know about the world, and what haven't I allowed myself to learn that now I can just discover and not have to worry about what does God think. I can just learn about it, So I had those moments, but.
Oh, sorry, not to interrupt us. Could there also be the search for meaning now that you've lost sort of a foundational sense of meaning, that you're trying to sort of make sense of the world now that you've lost the foundation a little bit?
I think that's a good thing to kind of like come back to, like, as far as foundational, like, did I lose? Well, I did. I mean, I did lose my meaning in life at a certain point. Like my purpose was to be a pastor, and I mean, everything was kind of planned out, and then that's all, the rug's pulled out from under you. And so, yeah, I mean, of course you're going to look like, what can I trust? What can I find purpose in? And for me, like, I've always been very, like, for lack of a better word, because this word's kind of silly, but I've always been a very, like, passionate about whatever I'm into. When I was a kid, it was football. Like, I loved football, and that was life. That was everything. And then as I became a teenager and got older, I got into the Bible. It fascinated me, and it still is really interesting to me. And I was really passionate about that. And then when I knew I wasn't going to be a pastor, it's like, well, what's the point in studying this anymore? Like, it's interesting to me, but am I gonna, So yeah, I do think there is kind of this, well, what's the thing that makes me come alive? What's the thing that makes me excited about life? So yes, I think in that sense, I was looking for something, meaning, something to make me feel fulfilled,
Okay. So yeah, gotcha. So it's more of a sense of personal fulfillment, and as opposed to like trying to sort of build something new from the rubble.
Like a foundation. Yeah. The pseudoscience piece is interesting. I think I was never one of these like hardcore, like Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris. It's got to be like perfectly scientific, or else it has no meaning in life or matter or whatever. They're just kind of like, they're so scientifically minded. Like that's everything to them. And for me, I don't care if in the movie the science is wrong. Mm-hmm. Like, to me, it's about the art of it, or it's about the meaning behind it. What's the message trying to convey? Now, if I was a scientist, I might be, irked at the fact that they get some theory wrong, or they screwed up the science of it, because now lay people are going to watch the movie and be like, oh, that's what that means, So if you're like, if you're one of these prominent scientists or something, that probably would be frustrating. But I'm cool with the kind of the flexibility of that.
Yeah. As sort of a theology and sort of church history buff, I sort of have that. Somebody says something about the Council of Nicaea editing the books or something. I'm like, oh.
I can't do this.
Yeah,
you're wrong. Yeah.
Or Mithras was also, born of a virgin. No, he wasn't. What are you talking about? So yeah, I know what you mean. I do think sometimes when people move from, especially like religion to atheism, science can be used as a sort of foundational thing that you build. Well, the term for it's actually scientism, where science almost becomes kind of a religious or philosophical vantage point.
Yeah.
I think that can be, incoherent and obnoxious.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is interesting to watch the movie. I think because I think some of these things become sort of cliches. And I think for that, maybe that's the artistry of it more than the science of it, that I get sort of frustrated with the cliche of, of the butterfly effect or the cliche of, string theory. And now, we can do all these different multiple universes based on human choices or whatever. Maybe that's where I found it frustrating, not because I thought it was inaccurate, but just because I was like, okay, we've
heard this before.
Yeah, we've seen it so many times. Hitchcock called it a MacGuffin. So that you have this thing in a film that moves the action forward. So you have this something that somebody's looking for or trying to destroy or whatever. Maybe it's a bomb they're trying to find. It's really just there to give the character something to do. And so it's a little bit like that, where it doesn't really matter what the thing is. It's just that it's there to allow the plot to move forward.
Okay, yeah, maybe that's kind of what you're thinking. Like maybe that's what some of these scientific theories they were throwing in were, just kind of move the plot along.
Yeah, it's there because it kind of helps you, to move the ideas forward. But it was interesting to me though that they mix these, ultimately kind of pseudoscientific but ostensibly scientific ideas with this religious folk tale of, because this whole idea is that before you're born, the future, but an angel touches your lip and you forget it. But that never happened to Nemo. So that's why he's able to look forward and see all these things.
That was interesting to me too. Yeah.
So, which actually there is it's sort of this folk religious thing, but there is a similar idea in Islam that everyone before they're born is a Muslim, and then when you're born, you forget Islam.
I believe that's true of Mormons, not in the same sense, not that everyone's a Mormon, but I believe Mormons think that they used to exist and then they're born. Like they used to exist in the heavenly realm and then they come to earth, they're born in earth. And
that's correct. Yeah. So
that made me think of Mormonism.
Yeah. Yeah. For Mormons, the God the Father is a physical being, but he has many wives that he copulates with, and then what are born are what are called spirit babies, and so then they're looking for physical bodies to inhabit.
That was really interesting, especially coming from like a Christian background and knowing a little bit about Mormonism. I was like, oh, this is really interesting that they're throwing this in there,
Yeah, but you sort of hear that kind of stuff, like almost like a sort of like a Neoplatonic stuff too. That the idea that you have this soul that pre-exists your body and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But I wondered if the mix of these two things together, these ostensibly scientific things, and then this sort of religious-y folktale, were meant to kind of underline the notion that life is, sort of both rational and mystical. That there are things that you can put under a microscope, but then there are things you can't, and so that Nemo's, sort of living in a world that's both.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's rational, mystical. And then the rational would correspond to me to choice, and the mystical would correspond to chance.
Mm-hmm.
Like I was saying earlier that I thought the movie was about choice and chance. Those were huge themes in it. And I think that goes perfectly with what you're saying about rational, mystical. Because, there's this moment where his dad slips on a leaf and then the mom comes to help him. And that's how they meet, and then they get married. So it's this total chance encounter. But then there's these choices that he makes, there's choices all throughout the film, but the choice he made to be, wealthy and to marry a certain woman and to have everything the way he wants. There is a part of life where we do make these choices and we fall through on these plans, and that's a part of it. And they work out for us sometimes. And that's one part of it. And then there's the other piece of it where, well, if this, or this didn't happen, everything would have fallen apart. None of this would have happened, So yeah, I do think that there's definitely kind of this balance between rational and mystical in the film for sure.
Yeah. Does that resonate with you in any sense, or have you shed yourself of all superstitious impulses?
No, I think what you're getting at with that question is really important, because there are a lot of atheists out there, and I'd say probably a lot of the more vocal ones who come across as people who would adhere to scientism or militant atheists,
Mm-hmm.
Like kind of atheists have this bad reputation of being in your face and like, you're stupid if you believe in religious stuff, and they want to like show you how much smarter they are than you. I mean, that's kind of this reputation that atheists have. And I know a lot of atheists that aren't that way. We just maybe aren't the more vocal ones, but as far as like incorporating spirituality or mysticism to some degree in my life, I'm okay with it the way I define it. So like saying spiritual, obviously I don't believe in a soul. I don't believe in a spiritual realm. So when I say spiritual, to me, it's like emotional. It's like, I guess it has to do with that, like finding purpose and feel a sense of awe, having awe, like being in nature and seeing like, you know, an amazing sunset, or being in a forest and just an amazing view, and having that sense of awe and wonder about life can feel spiritual, you know, and I'm totally fine with that type of thing. And I'm okay with mystery too. Like, someone I talked to recently was talking about, letting the mystery be, you know what I mean? Like being okay with like not having all the answers. And as an atheist, I'm okay with that. I'm okay with just, you know, maybe I can't explain this or that. That's okay with me. You know, I'm okay with, yeah, I don't know. So you get the idea.
Gotcha. Yeah. Yeah. I think one of the terms for it is numinous. You know, sort of suggesting almost like the presence of divinity or something like that. That you maybe have, you know, as you're looking through nature, holding your newborn child in your arms or something like that. You sort of feel like, you know, okay, well, even if you tend toward a very rationalistic approach, you sort of feel like, okay, there's something to this that's like almost magical that I can't quite put my finger on, but I feel it.
Yeah. I would agree with that. And I think there's actually quite a few of agnostics and atheists that I think are okay with that idea, who wouldn't say it's God or spiritual, but a spiritual realm, but would definitely feel those feelings and say that's a huge part of their life too, is, you know, those moments that, like you said, are kind of magical or deeply profound. Yeah.
Well, yeah, ironically, I would say Dawkins even has a book called The Magic of Reality, where he's trying to sort of invest the numinous with a sort of a natural origin or whatever. But
there's a great book by a French philosopher called The Little Book of Atheist Spirituality. And the title itself is super intriguing. You know, like, what? Atheist, spiritual? How can those things go together? But the first two chapters I really loved. And he gets into a lot of this type of stuff. But he's a philosopher, so like the third chapter is like super philosophical, and I was almost kind of like, but it's that idea of kind of incorporating, you know, the rational with the mystical.
Gotcha.
I like it.
Yeah. So we probably should start wrapping up, because we've been doing this for about an hour now, and I don't want to keep you too long. What are some thoughts that you kind of like to leave off with, as, you know, things that maybe you sort of came away with from the film that maybe we haven't really covered yet, or something like that?
Man, I feel like we've covered a lot. I mean, my favorite parts are kind of the ones that I mentioned, where, you know, he says every path's the right path. Each of these lives is the right one. He says everything could have been anything else and it would have had just as much meaning. And I think for someone, like we were saying, looking back on their life and wondering what could have been, or if they did it right, just being able to accept that you're not going to make all the right choices in life, and that's okay. And to have kind of compassion on yourself when you make mistakes. I think that for me, that's the takeaway. And that's, you know, it's personal, obviously, like I'm associating it with my experience. But that's what I take away from it. Yeah. That kind of like finding peace with where you're at in life, in a way. Yeah.
Well, well, one thing that sort of comes to my mind, that, and I'll kind of come back to it again, because I sort of said this earlier, that any choice you would have made would have had just as much meaning, or maybe I would use the word significance there, since I've already distinguished those two. But if you are married to a Gene, who is the character in the film, who he marries, who he's unhappy with, maybe you should find that to be just as meaningful and wonderful, and try to enjoy it, as opposed to going back and thinking, I wish I would have ended up with this troubled girl who was in love with somebody else, who would have made my life a living hell.
Yeah, I like that message too. I think sometimes we miss the great things that are in our life right now by looking elsewhere.
Absolutely.
Oh man, that's what she says to him too. Like in the movie, she says, I think she says like, you're always elsewhere, or something like that, when she's by the pool and, you know, she finds this letter and you're always elsewhere, you know? And I think that's the point. Like, he's looking around for happiness when he should appreciate what he has, kind of thing.
Well, and actually he's dropping in and out of the two different choices, the one where he marries Elise and one where he marries Jean. Because if you recall, he even like he's confused when he sees the other kids, because he's sort of in this other world with you know, Elise or whatever.
Yeah. And that comes back to the Zugzwang, you know, the only viable move is not to move. So stop looking at these other options here. Stop thinking about these other things. Just learn to be okay with, learn to, be interested in and find meaning and significance and happiness. Look for happiness in the life you have, and in ways that you can find it in this life, in this path,
Yeah, that's great. And I think that's very wise. And I appreciate you being here with me today. And if somebody wanted to check out some of these deconversion stories, where would they find that?
Yeah, they can Google Voices of Deconversion, or it's voicesofdeconversion.com or vodpodcast.com. Either one will get you there. And if they want to reach out to me and they have any questions about the podcast or are interested in anything, they can reach me at steve@vodpodcast.com. So they can email me. I'm also on Twitter. So you can find Voices of Deconversion on Twitter and Facebook. So those are kind of the main places.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Steve. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Cody. Appreciate it.